The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
Thanks for joining us again in our study of Second Timothy. In this video, we're ready for 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 16. So let's begin by reading verses 16 through 19. But shun profane and idle babblings, for they will increase to more ungodliness. And their message will spread like cancer. Hymenaeus and Philetus are of this sort, who have strayed concerning the truth, saying that the resurrection is already past, and they overthrow the faith of some. Nevertheless, the solid foundation of God stands, having this seal: the Lord knows those who are His, and let everyone who names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. Paul tells Timothy to shun profane and idle babblings. Now, those terms are terms Paul has used prior to this. In fact, we see them repeatedly in 1 Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 6, Paul said that some had strayed, they had turned aside to idle talk. In 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, he told Timothy to reject profane and old wives' fables. And then in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20, Paul said to Timothy, guard what was committed to your trust, avoiding profane and idle babblings and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. So these terms, idle and profane and babblings, we've seen them already. What is Paul talking about? Well, he gave us some information there in chapter 6, verse 20 of 1 Timothy that it's easy to overlook, but it's important. He said that these things grew out of or were connected with what is falsely called knowledge. Now, Paul used the Greek word gnosis there, and it is the word from which we get Gnostic. And there are several indications. This is one of them, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 20. But there are several indications in Paul's letters to Timothy that Gnosticism, or some early version of it, what scholars call proto-Gnosticism, was being taught by false teachers in Asia Minor, where Timothy was working. And it's not my intention in this segment to dwell at length on Gnosticism. If you want more information on what Gnostics taught, you can go to VBR series on 1 Timothy, and you can go to the second video. The second video covers 1 Timothy 1, verses 1 through 5. And if you scroll to about minute 22, you'll get some information on what the doctrines of the Gnostics were. For our purposes in this study, I'll just point out that Gnosticism was an amalgamation of various things. They drew from Greek philosophy, Eastern mysticism, they drew from the Bible and Christianity, unfortunately, and they created this doctrine which said that salvation, as they defined it, was not gained through the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Rather, it was gained through the acquisition of knowledge, falsely so called. In other words, they thought it was knowledge, but it wasn't real. So it was knowledge of lies, but it wasn't knowledge of truth. And of course, Timothy was to have nothing to do with this. He was told to avoid it in 1 Timothy 6. He's told to shun it here. And this would necessarily have included keeping it and those who insisted on teaching it out of the church. That was going to be the only way to truly fulfill this command. Because a little leaven leavens the whole lump. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 6. False teachers and false teaching can be very tenacious. Paul is giving this command to Timothy a second time. He commanded him in this in 1 Timothy 6:20, and he's doing it again here. Why? Well, it seems like one of two scenarios must have been playing out. Either Timothy had done everything he could since he had received 1 Timothy, but he had just not yet been able to sufficiently deal with the problem, or Timothy had not done what he needed to do to deal with the problem. But whatever the case, it was still a problem. This doctrine was still a threat. False teaching doesn't tend to go away until it is made to go away. And how do you make it go away? Well, Paul tells Timothy exactly what to do. Shun and avoid these babblings. Don't give the false teachers an audience. Don't give them the floor. Don't give them listeners. And once you do that, they'll either give up their doctrine or they'll go elsewhere. And that's good teaching for us today. That's exactly the same way we need to deal with any false teaching that tries to creep into the church and insists on having its way. We need to shun it and avoid it, including those who teach it. Now, Paul follows up this command with his reason for it. He says to Timothy, they will increase to more ungodliness. Who's they? Well, the ones who teach it. In the next verse, we're going to read their message. So the ones who are teaching this doctrine, they're going to increase to more ungodliness. These progressives, these proto-Gnostic or Gnostic progressives, well, they're going to progress all right, but in entirely the wrong direction. Their doctrine and the lifestyle it produces is already ungodly, and it's only going to get more so. It's not going to dissipate. It's not going to stagnate. It's going to worsen. This is a case of one sin leading to another to another. In fact, Paul says in verse 17, their message is going to spread like cancer. Now, the word he uses for cancer is the Greek word gangreina. It's the word from which we get gangrene. And a number of translations actually translate it that way, that their message will spread like gangrene. Now, according to Mayo Clinic's website, modern-day gangrene just refers to death of body tissue, either due to a lack of blood flow or a serious bacterial infection. Now, of course, the ancients could see the same symptoms we see, but they didn't have the knowledge of the causes, as we do in many cases today. But this word does seem to refer to something similar. This term was used by the Greek physicians for an eating sore, which would eat away at the flesh. And according to Galen, a Greek physician, surgeon, and philosopher who lived in the 2nd century A.D., it would often end in death of the tissue. And that is a powerful description of this false doctrine. Their message is going to spread just like that. Paul knew by inspiration that these teachers, those who propounded this doctrine, were going to, over time, spread their sphere of influence. They were going to gain an increasing number of adherents. And where were those adherents, at least a portion of them, going to come from? They were going to come from within the body of Christ. And those in the body of Christ who got infected with this doctrine, if it couldn't be successfully treated, it was going to kill them. It was going to result in the loss of their salvation. It was going to result in eternal death. And Paul lists the names of two men who were propounding this doctrine. Hymenaeus and Philetus, he says, are of this sort. Now, Philetus is not mentioned anywhere else in the New Testament. Hymenaeus is, however. Hymenaeus was mentioned in 1 Timothy. In 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 19 and 20, we learn that concerning the faith, Hymenaeus had suffered shipwreck. Paul had withdrawn from Hymenaeus in the hope that he would learn to stop blaspheming. And what this reveals to us is that he had not learned. Hymenaeus was still out there teaching lies. He and Philetus had strayed concerning the truth, 18, and they were saying that the resurrection was already past. Now, we don't know the details of their doctrine. We don't know how they were convincing people of this lie. One possibility is that they had spiritualized the resurrection, that they were saying something along the lines of, yes, you've experienced a resurrection, you experienced that when you were converted, but there's no future bodily resurrection to look forward to. That's possible. That may have been what they were teaching, and if so, they may have been using scriptures that Paul himself had written to propound this. Romans chapter 6, verse 4, Colossians chapter 2, verse 12. Interestingly, Irenaeus, who wrote in the 2nd century, in his work called Against Heresies, did talk about a Gnostic teacher by the name of Menander. And Menander taught that his disciples obtained the resurrection by being baptized into him. So that's what a Gnostic teacher was saying in the 2nd century, and it may have been what Hymenaeus and Philetus were saying in the 1st century. Whether or not that was the case, it may be worth noting at this point that we do know that there were, even apart from this passage, even if we didn't have 2 Timothy, we would know that there were those in the 1st century who were saying that there was not going to be a future bodily resurrection. This is dealt with extensively in 1 Corinthians 15. In 1 Corinthians 15, verse 12, Paul said, "Now if Christ is preached that he has been raised from the dead, how do some among you say that there is no resurrection of the dead?" There were those at the church at Corinth who were saying there's not going to be a future resurrection. Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 35, he said, but someone will say, apparently one of these false teachers, how are the dead raised up? And with what body do they come? In other words, one of the things they were saying to debunk the resurrection is they were making the logical fallacy, what's called the argument from ignorance. They were in essence saying, I don't see how that could happen, so it's not going to happen. They were doing exactly what the Sadducees were doing. They were denying the power of God. Matthew 22, verse 29. So in the first century, this was one of Satan's tools. There were various individuals working among the churches, trying to infiltrate or among the churches, and they were saying, no, there's not going to be any future bodily resurrection. If there's a resurrection, it's one you've already experienced, or one that's already happened, and there's none coming. Any doctrine, though, that denies a future bodily resurrection denies one of the elementary principles of Christ. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 2. The writer of Hebrews enumerates 6 basic principles of Christ, and resurrection of the dead is among them. So Hymenaeus and Philetus were denying a fundamental of the faith, and as a result, they were overthrowing the faith of some. That's the word Paul uses here. It's a word that means to ruin. It's the same word that is used of Jesus in John 2, verse 15, when he overturned the tables of the money changers. In that case, he literally overturned the table. Here, it's a figurative use. These men were overturning the people's faith, overthrowing it, and ruining it. Christians can disagree on some things. Romans 14 is clear about that. We don't all have to see everything exactly the same way. We're at different stages of growth and different stages of development. But clinging to this doctrine was fatal. Hymenaeus and Philetus had blood on their hands. Saints were losing their souls as a direct consequence of these men's work. Living stones were being ripped off the foundation. It's a sobering thing to think that that was going on. And we know it goes on today, but it was going on then. And that Hymenaeus and Philetus may have to face the Lord on the judgment day for what they did. We hope they repented. In verse 19, we read here, nevertheless, the solid foundation of God stands. Now this stands in sharp contrast to the shaken and overthrown faith that Paul had just talked about. Human faith may be shaken, but there is something solid, Paul is saying here, that is not shaken. It's the solid foundation of God, which is the truth that God has revealed. It remains unmoved. It remains unshaken. It reminds me of what Paul says in Ephesians 2:20 when he speaks of the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone. John Adams, the second president of the United States, prior to the beginning of the United States of America, was serving as a lawyer in Massachusetts, and he actually accepted the responsibility of defending the British regulars who had fired on the Continentals in the Boston Massacre. And in the course of his defense, he made this famous statement, facts are stubborn things. Which is to say, of course, facts don't change. The foundation of God, the truth that God has revealed, is not going to change. People can walk away from its foundation, but they can't take the foundation with them. They can deny a foundation is there, but that doesn't change the fact that it is there. People may attack the truth. They may make fun of the truth. They may ignore the truth. They may abandon the truth. But none of that is going to change the truth. That's the promise here. Hymenaeus and Philetus may appear to be having a great deal of quote-unquote success, and it may make people think that maybe they're right since they're having success. People can think that sort of way some of the time. But that's not the case. God's truth remains unshaken, unmoved, unchanged. And it has this seal, says Paul, this inscription or motto on it. This apparently was something that was common in ancient life. On the foundation, they would have some kind of inscription written. And on this foundation, this solid truth of God, there are two things written. The first speaks to the security of the church. The second to the purity of the church. And I might just note, before we look at the two statements, that it may be that Paul is alluding back to Numbers chapter 16 in the rebellion and the events surrounding Korah, Dathan, and Abiram as he mentions these two things. And I'll point that out as we're looking at them. But the first inscription, the first of these statements that's on this solid foundation is, the Lord knows those who are His. Now, in Numbers chapter 16, verse 5, Moses had said to Korah and his company, and recall what Korah, Dathan, and Abiram were saying. They came to Moses and Aaron and they said, you take too much upon yourselves. The whole congregation is holy. We all ought to be able to do the things that you do. You're not so special. And Moses said to Korah and his company, Numbers chapter 16, verse 5, tomorrow morning the Lord will show who is His and who is holy. The Lord knows who's holy, and tomorrow He's going to reveal it. And those of us who are well acquainted with that story know how the Lord did that. Now, this statement, the Lord knows those who are His, in this context, seems to be intended, I think, to serve as an encouragement to Timothy and to the brethren who had thus far remained faithful. Yes, some had abandoned the truth, and more were going to do so. But God's vision was not clouded by this. Man's vision might be, but God's vision was not. God knew who was remaining true to Him, and He would not fail to reward them. God knows who you are. He recognizes your faithfulness, and He's taking note. So take heart. But those who want to continue to be recognized by God must do the following. And that's the second part of this inscription. Let everyone who names the name of Christ depart from iniquity. And again, this may reference back to number 16. In number 16, verse 24, God told Moses to say to the congregation, get away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. God was getting ready to punish these people and those who were connected with them. And so the people who were innocent of the rebellion were told to get away so that they would not participate in the other's destruction. And that seems to be the idea here. The brethren needed to keep themselves separate from Hymenaeus and Philetus and others who were teaching this doctrine for the same reason, because these men were headed to destruction. And if you want to avoid that destruction, you need to avoid and shun them and what they teach. This was a call to maintain pure religion, to keep oneself unspotted from the world. James chapter 1, verse 27. Now, interestingly, having used this foundation metaphor, Paul continues with architectural imagery, picking up in verse 20. So let's read verses 20 through 22. But in a great house there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but also of wood and clay, some for honor and some for dishonor. Therefore, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter, he will be a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful for the master, prepared for every good work. Flee also youthful lusts, but pursue righteousness, faith, love, peace with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. In a great house, says Paul, the house of God, which is the church of the living God, 1 Timothy 3, verse 15, is the greatest house of all. In a great house, says Paul, there are not only vessels of gold and silver, but of wood and clay. The vessels Paul's talking about here are people. People are vessels. Romans chapter 9, verses 22 and 23, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7. And just as not all vessels in a physical house are made out of the same material, and they're not all the same, so also all the vessels in the church, all the people in the church are not the same. No, Paul mentions four materials here, and he mentions them in order of decreasing value. Now, what do we make of that? Well, all people are of equal intrinsic value. That is, each of us was made in the image of God, and God desires that everyone be saved. But not everyone in the church has made himself or herself equally valuable in terms of usefulness. Some of those vessels, Paul says, are for honor. Some are for dishonor. There's the fine china, and then there's what at home we call the chicken bucket, where all the scraps go, and it can get pretty unpleasant in that bucket before it's taken out to the chicken. We've got honorable vessels, which are used for honorable things. We're only going to whip out the china when we're maybe having a special meal for special people. But the chicken bucket, we're not going to put it out for our friends and family. It's made for something dishonorable. Even in the church, there exists the holy and the hypocrite. In the church, there is the wheat and there are the weeds. One variety can be used by God for honorable purposes. The other cannot. But, verse 21, Paul says, if anyone cleanses himself from the latter. Now, what does he mean by latter? Well, he means the last of the two things he just mentioned. And he had just mentioned honor and dishonor. So if anyone cleanses himself from dishonor, if anyone cleanses himself from the sinful activity that he's been using his vessel for, if he departs from iniquity, per the statement in verse 19, then what will happen? He will become a vessel for honor, sanctified and useful for the master. This is so encouraging. My past does not dictate my future. What dictates my future is the decisions I make in the present. We have it in our power. God has given us the free will to choose what kind of vessel we will be. And if we've been the wrong kind of vessel, if we're the wrong kind of vessel now, we, by God's grace, can alter our makeup. This passage is, by the way, completely incompatible with Calvinism. God has given us that power to make the decision what kind of vessel we're going to be. And if we choose to be a vessel that is cleansed from sin and is thus prepared for every good work. Contrast this with Titus chapter 1, verse 16. In Titus chapter 1, verse 16, Paul said, they profess to know God, but in works they deny Him, being abominable, disobedient, that is, they've not departed from iniquity. And what's the result? They're disqualified for every good work. Paul actually has quite a bit to say in 2 Timothy and in Titus about our relationship to good works. Beyond what we've already noted, in Titus chapter 2, verse 14, we learned that the Lord gave Himself for the purpose of having a people who were zealous for good works. Twice in Titus chapter 3, verse 14, and Titus chapter 3, verse 8 and verse 14, Paul mentions the importance of maintaining good works. In 2 Timothy 3, verse 16, we learned that the Word of God thoroughly equips us for every good work. So, taken all together, we have a choice. I can choose to be disqualified for every good work, Titus 1:16, or I can choose to be prepared and thoroughly equipped for every good work. The choice is mine. But good works are not truly good unless I'm good. That's one of the important messages here. Back in the book of Haggai, in Haggai chapter 2, this was pointed out in verses 10 through 14. And God said that the children of Israel, what they were offering at the temple, it was unclean. Maybe they brought the right kind of sacrifice. Maybe they did it at the right time and in the right way as far as all the externals go. But because they themselves were unclean, they weren't putting sin out of their life. It polluted their sacrifice. And our good works are polluted if we ourselves are not truly seeking the Lord. So we have to get ourselves right to make our works right, so that we are truly useful for honorable work by the Lord. And now Paul tells Timothy how he specifically can be sure to make himself a vessel for honor. In verse 22, he tells him, flee also youthful lusts. Flee. Run away. Like Joseph ran away from Potiphar's wife, flee, Timothy, youthful lusts. Now the word lusts here means a desire for something forbidden or an inordinate desire. It's translated lusts here in the New King James and in the New American Standard. It's translated passions in the ESV, and in the NIV it's translated evil desires. Now, when we hear the term youthful lusts, our mind may tend to go in a particular direction. We may tend to think that this is referring to illicit sexual desire, and it certainly would include that, but I don't believe it's limited to that. There are other desires that are wrong, that plague young men. Among them, a love of pleasure, a love of applause, that is, a love of the praise of men, pride. These are youthful lusts as well, and Timothy needed to flee all of them, so that they would not hinder his usefulness to the master. And in place of those things, he was to pursue righteousness, faith, love, and peace. And I don't want us to miss this point, because this is really important. This is brass tacks, down-to-earth, nitty-gritty Christian living we're talking about, what he's talking about here. We flee things, but we have to pursue something in their place. If we want to bring about lasting change in our life, a rehabilitation of ourselves, if you will, both of those things have to be there. Yes, we must put things off, Colossians 3, but we also must put some things on. Yes, we must remove some things, but we also must replace them with something else. We must flee, but we must also chase after something else. And what was Timothy to chase after? Righteousness, right living. He was to chase after faith. That is true trust in God. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will direct your paths. Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. And that kind of faith, of course, manifests itself in obedient living, because faith produces works. He was to pursue love, that is, those behaviors that are enumerated by Paul in 1 Corinthians 13, 4 through 7. It is interesting, isn't it? That when Paul describes love, he doesn't describe how it feels. He describes how it behaves. And Timothy needed to pursue those kinds of behaviors. He needed to put others before himself. He needed to pursue peace, that is, harmony with others. In stark contrast to what the false teachers were doing, they loved strife. They loved to argue. 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 5. But Timothy needed to pursue peace with all people and with the brethren. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 14. And then notice how the verse ends. As Timothy was pursuing these things, he was to do it with those who call on the Lord out of a pure heart. That is, with faithful brethren. The quest for holiness need not be a lonely enterprise. We may feel sometimes like it is, but it doesn't need to be. And if you've got faithful brethren in your life, it doesn't have to be. Holiness is something we can pursue in community, if you will. Notice, if you look through the New Testament, one of the things I love about Bible programs is that I can sit down at my laptop and I can type in a whole phrase, and then I can search certain parts of the Bible, and I can discover where that phrase comes up everywhere in the Bible. And I think most people who are watching this probably have access to that kind of software or an app that does that. Just type in the expression one another and search the New Testament. And you find that the expression is everywhere throughout the New Testament. We're to comfort and edify one another. We're to teach and admonish one another. We're to exhort one another daily. We're to bear with one another and forgive one another. We're to be hospitable to one another. We're to consider one another. We're to pray for one another. These are the sorts of things that we tap into and experience in the Christian life in the 21st century, and they were the sorts of things that Timothy was to tap into in the first century. As an evangelist, he might have times where he would feel like no one in proximity to him would understand, or at least he wouldn't be able to share his burden with them. But in the case of pursuing holiness and righteousness and faith and love and peace, this was something he did not need to do alone. Yes, he had the responsibility of helping the brethren, but in this the brethren could help him. They needed him, he needed them. We need one another. And God has graciously given us exactly that. We're going to close there in this segment and plan in our next segment to pick up in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 23. Hope to see you then.